this module is about the Gershwin brothers, George Gershwin and Ira Gershwin. George Gershwin wrote music for about 20 Broadway musicals and contributed songs to, say, another between 9 or 10, maybe even 12. His brother Ira Gershwin was a lyricist on a lot of Mr. George Gershwin's work. The Gershwins together form an important songwriting team of the 1930s. Gershwin is also probably notable for sort of bridging the gap between classical music and that world and jazz, and bringing those two things together. We'll talk a little bit about that during this lecture as well. George Gershwin lived from 1898 to 1932. A pretty short life when you think about it, and all the more incredible because I think when you go looking for Gershwin work and you seek out how much music there is, it seems like there's a lot. It seems like the sort of output that a person who lived a very long life would have been able to put together. Ira Gershwin lived much longer. He lived from 1896 to 1983, and much of the latter part of Ira's life was spent as sort of an archivist and sort of a keeper of the Gershwin flame, a person who answered questions about George Gershwin, a person who managed to keep the catalog of Gershwin songs organized and very much alive and promoted them. I want to tell you a little bit about both of their lives, and as you can see with the module you're looking at, you'll have, again, as often is the case, links to some Gershwin music and links to a couple of YouTube clips. There'll also be another quiz. The quiz you're going to look at is connecting this and some previous material as well. So please take a look at that. And also please take a look at the discussions. I've opened up several discussions, and I have to remind you, because some folks have weighed in a lot more than other folks with these, that they are a graded part of your, they're part of your participation grade. And all you have to do is post. All you have to do is say something and suggest a song. Often it's me sending you out to search for a song and talk about it a bit. George Gershwin was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1898. There's not a lot in Gershwin's boyhood to suggest that he would become a great composer. He's really was more interested in outdoor play. He was a bit of an athlete. He showed very little interest in books, very little interest in the theater or music. But he did have a few scattered musical experiences that seemed to have changed his life. He was exposed to some jazz music outside of a nightclub as a very young child. He attended a violin performance of a schoolmate at a public assembly, and that person became a very good friend of his, a man named Max Rosenzweig. Was later went by the stage name of Max Rosen and toured as a professional violinist. When George was 12, his family bought a piano, and he started taking lessons. And his music teacher felt very much that he had a talent not only for playing, but certainly for composing, and felt that it was very important to keep young George interested in classical music in particular. I've got this letter from George's music teacher to a friend where he writes, "The boy is a genius without doubt. He wants to go in for this modern stuff, for jazz and whatnot. We mustn't let him do this. I have to see that he gets a firm foundation in standard classical music." Well, when Gershwin was 15 years old, he got a job, where else, just like those other folks, in Tin Pan Alley. He lied about his age. He told them he was 18 years old, and he got a regular hourly job composing music and working for one of these companies. He wound up contributing song after song and was paid really peanuts for an awful lot of it, but still managed to create a lot of successful music in that time period, including songs called When You Want 'Em, You Can Get 'Em, The Making of a Girl, some stuff you may not have heard of. But early Gershwin is jazzy, very, very popular music in its day. In 1919, he wrote a song called Swanee, which the actor Al Jolson, funny, some of our discussions have brought Al Jolson up as being the actor who has the distinction of being the first person whose voice is heard in a movie. Jolson came to him and said, "I want a song." Max Dreyfus, the boss of the company at Tin Pan Alley, gave the job to Gershwin. Gershwin wrote a song called Swanee, which became very, very successful for him. Ira Gershwin, his brother, really didn't want to work with George Gershwin at first. He didn't want to be perceived as riding on his brother's coattails or anything along those lines. And so to that end, he avoided it for a very, very long period. During that time, George Gershwin continued to write for Tin Pan Alley, little songs. He also had a bigger vision. He wanted to write for a big orchestra. And he wanted to write not just songs with words and vocals, but symphonic orchestral pieces. Perhaps the best known Gershwin piece, and a huge breakthrough for him, comes in 1924. It's a piece you may have heard of before called Rhapsody in Blue. That is definitely one of the links that you're going to see connected to our module here. And you'll see different pieces of Rhapsody in Blue in the module, and you'll listen to it and go, huh, I've heard that before in a commercial, or I've heard that riff before, in some other context. Rhapsody in Blue is pretty famous for that. What Rhapsody in Blue is most historically, and by the way, this is an instrumental piece. It is not a show. It does not have words. It's designed as a large symphonic piece for an orchestra. And one of the things that makes it significant is the fact that it deliberately bridges the gap between classical music and jazz. It has some elements of jazz, what we might call the bent note. That part of a song where a trumpet, rather than just hits a note right on, it goes, ah, just kind of goes, ah, and works its way in, or kind of goes down. It has what we might call, again, I was having a hard time explaining syncopation to you last time at Berlin. There's a lot of syncopation in Gershwin as well. It has this sense that the beat is not just the percussion 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 2, but sometimes crazy things happen with the beat, and the melody, the tune of it, doesn't occur in sync with the beat, but off the beat. Rhapsody in Blue is also a case where what Gershwin was trying to do was to say that jazz deserved a place where you have to get dressed up to listen to it, that it's important that it should be reflected as uniquely American, but also worthy of a classical audience. For that matter, he felt that classical music had a chance to draw a broader audience if it had some native, as in American, composers. So Rhapsody in Blue does a lot of things, but most importantly, it kind of connects some of Gershwin's love of classical music that was so bred into him in the early days with Gershwin's appreciation of jazz, which was just something he sort of got naturally. With Ira Gershwin is a little bit of a different story. He, as I said, sort of knocked around and did an awful lot of things, trying really, really hard not to be on a Gershwin show. On the other hand, he was also born in New York City. He was the editor of his local school newspaper. He failed as a scholar. He dropped out of school several times. He writes in his autobiography, and tell me if you've heard of this kind of person. Ira Gershwin went to a couple schools, and sometimes he would stay in school, particularly at Columbia, for long stretches of time. And he writes, the only possible way, it seemed, that I would get a diploma were if I were to remain long enough in one place that I would earn one by squatter's rights, that the faculty and fellow students would be so tired of my presence that they would award me a diploma simply to be rid of me. Well, some people, that's their strategy. For Gershwin, he never did get that degree. He went on to other things. He transferred to night college. He worked as a cashier in a Turkish bath, handing out towels to people coming out of the sauna. He was paid $1 for editing a major short story, and he had it framed and said, well, this is the time I was paid for some of my writing. And he kept on writing, and finally, his brother persuaded him and said, all right, look, we have a show called Lady Be Good. I desperately need somebody. You can use a pseudonym. You can write and say you're somebody else. I just want you to give it a try. And from that point, it turned out that they worked extraordinarily well together. In most Gershwin songs, Gershwin came up with the melody, George came up with the melody first, and the tune, and then he would play it out, and then Ira would make up words for that tune. Some writers and collaborators work the other way around, and some do it all at once, but that was how they worked. And for the most part, you see it a lot with their work. You see that Ira has a real style. You recognize it. It has a certain poetic cadence to it almost every time. Gershwin pieces developed into other things beyond just this classical jazzy stuff, particularly a lot of ballads, a lot of what we like to call torch songs. The idea that, well, let me put it this way, Gershwin never met an alto he didn't like. And he wrote a lot of beautiful melodies down the octave and designed to be sung for women with lower voices. He also wrote an awful lot of sad songs where a character was bemoaning the fact that they had let someone go and now they couldn't have them again. And those torch songs are a real Gershwin trademark. You see a lot of them. And in fact, if you go out hunting for a Gershwin song, you're probably going to find a Gershwin ballad, and it's probably going to sound like that. In the next segment, as I always do, I'm going to take a little break here between our segments, and if you want to take a listen to Rhapsody in Blue, this might be a good time for that. And when we come back, I'll talk to you a little bit more about how these ballads were structured and give you some examples of those ballads, and we'll also talk about a major theatrical production that the Gershwins put together. So this will conclude section 1 of our module, and I'll see you in section 2 in just a moment.